Landscape, I'll just go just for a second longer. In this novel, you at one point refer to the trees of the landscape which had been murdered, the murdered trees. And that leads me into, there's a whole tone of a kind of a, for me, delicious, but notwithstanding the deliciousness of melancholy in the book, sort of a meditation on all that has been lost. I wonder if you can comment on that tone of melancholy, that sense of loss.
There's a wonderful writer, his books are still with us, thank goodness, called William Maxwell, who was a fabulous writer of fiction, but was also the man who was the editor of The New Yorker during the time that Updike and Cheever and Alice Munro and Mavis Gallant and all kinds of wonderful writers were being handled and published by The New Yorker and edited by him. I remember reading a book of his called The Chateau, in which he said, "The past is always around us, and it's always waving goodbye." So that when you're in the 20th century, you see the remains of the 19th century right there. Or even in the beginnings of the 21st century, we're still able to see the remains of the 19th century, the sort of understructure, as it were, especially in the New World, as we call it, as opposed to Europe. I mean, the grid that was laid out by the people who first came here is still here. But some of the things that were created by them, you know, I think of rail fences or barns, are now just at that very, very, very heartbreaking stage where they're falling down. They're going to disappear, and they're never going to come back. And it's right at that moment that I think we start to look at them as the marvelous, marvelous things they really are, knowing we're losing them.
Yes, I know. I have a ruined farm of my own, and I went into the forest where I found the remains of split rail fences. So I take those rails and I lean them up against a tree, but I don't know what to do with them. But
there's nothing you can do, because there are no, had you a rail fence, you could make, you know, you could extend it or repair it with that. But I think it's important to pay attention to those traces that are left behind, because essentially we can't do what we're doing without what has gone before.
And yet, without looking at what has gone before, without considering what's gone before, but there's this incredible sadness, even the sadness of things. There's one section in the novel where it talks about old things being auctioned off. Old harnesses, old plows, and they disappear as if into nowhere. So yet again, you can't escape. It's en recherche du temps perdu, in a sense. The temps is toujours perdu, right? It's always gone. So that's very sad.
Well, I mean, there is something terribly sad about the breakdown of any known world. And I mean, coming from Europe, you would understand that much better than I do. I mean, there are various ways of worlds deconstructing, if you'll excuse the terribly academic term. There are terribly violent ways of worlds deconstructing, but there's also a kind of slower way where if it isn't, you know, violently removed from the landscape, the world that a child comes to know, it will eventually just kind of decay and disappear into the past. And there is something very sad about that.
And I don't want to exaggerate, you know, for those who have not yet bought the book, it is sad but exquisite, all right? So, exquisite, so make sure you
I paid him a lot of money to say that.
No, I had a really good time reading this book. There's some odds and ends about the book that I want to talk about. It comes up in some of your other works, but in this book in particular, I want to talk about glass. I mean, one of the books was a map of glass, of course, but in this book in particular, at the beginning, Liz is walking in the house and remembering things, and there's all this glass. She looks through the glass outside, she's reflected in the glass, and there's a collection of glass objects, which is kind of mysterious and comes kind of a mysterious end later on. So, you know, at the risk like sounding like a character out of Seinfeld, what's up with the glass? You know?
Got me.
Right, exactly. Ask a Seinfeld question, you get a Seinfeld answer. Well, let me then propose a few things about glass. You know, in that it has its reflective characteristics. It holds you away good title, by the way. And it also breaks fairly easily. It's fragile. So I'm wondering if there's something there to do with fragility as well. Am I, you know, I'm like a student
yes,
here.
of course, that all has to be true. But I should say that when I sit down to write, I don't intentionally choose images. I don't think I have ever intentionally chosen an image. I recognize it after it arrives, but I don't think, now how am I going to set the tone for fragility and reflection here? Again, it comes from observation more than anything else. I am often in a place where you can see the lake in a mirror at the same time as you see it reflected in an interior door that has a glass panel, or on the surfaces of the various framed paintings that are under glass in a room. And once I've made that observation, it becomes very interesting to me, and therefore something that I want to write about. It may even partly come from the days when I was a lyric poet. In other words, dealing with that kind of image in a very intense sort of way. But even then, I would not have chosen the image. I guess I should turn that around and say, really, the image chooses me?
Yes.
And when that happens, anytime I've attempted to be conscious of metaphor or imagery, it hasn't worked at all.
Well, yeah, I realize I shouldn't go to the author asking for that kind of question. Really, that's what you do in the classroom. But take my word for it, very beautiful images that happen there. I wonder if you could talk about what we talked about a bit in the green room before we came out here. You mentioned that you're living in circumstances that are somewhat similar to what happens in the book. Could you talk about your mother's house?
Yes. I now am living in the house that my mother and father bought when they returned to their own landscape at the point when my father semi-retired. And it's in Northumberland County. And in order to move into this house, I of course had to go through all of the things that, and I'm sure many people in this room have had this experience of going through a parent's belongings after one or both of them are dead. And in the case of my mother, she was the family archivist. So I was not only going through her cards, letters, photographs, I was going through my grandmother's cards, letters, and photographs, and in some cases my grandfather's and great-grandfather's. For example, my mother had in her possession every apron that had ever been worn by my grandmother, and some of the aprons that had been worn by my grandmother's mother. So you can see that there was a lot of stuff there. There were old chests filled with dowries upstairs, and by that I mean this sort of, monogrammed pillowcases and up in the attic, that kind of thing. And there was a story I could tell you that goes along with that too, but I won't because it would take all night. But I think the interesting thing is that almost everything I touched had a story connected to it.
So you're surrounded by artifacts now.
I am, but of course some of those had to be scattered. I mean, because in order to move in, you had to organize things so that you actually had some space. That was an important part. And I'm married to a visual artist.
Oh, they take space, don't they?
They need a lot of space. So I think that may have set the tone for this book in some way or another, or given me some kind of permission to write it, but I don't think that was the driving force behind it. I think the driving force behind it, again, is, as I said in the beginning, was my interest in what is happening to the monarchs, and by extension what's happening to the planet, and the use of migrant Mexican labor, and by extension what that says about us as a society.